Okay, we're live. Let's turn the wrong TV off. Oh, yeah, do the intro. Welcome everybody to live show 143, Kissing the Ring of Potus, coming to you from Minsk, Belarus on June 22, 2025, 8 p.m. local time. The world's watching, or at least those who dare to. We're streaming live on Rumble, X, YouTube, from the heart of this old Soviet shadow. We're tearing off the veil of the empire of lies. And tonight we've got Micheal from Buhanka Watch joining us to unravel the threads of this global spiderweb. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you doing, Dave? Hope you're keeping well.
Yes, I am good. Thank you very much. Where can people find you?
Well, if you just look up Buhanka Watch, it should bring my links to my the Telegram. Predominantly is where I'm active. The Telegram. I'm on Twitter as well, and a YouTube, which I don't really use too much anymore. So, but yeah, that's kind of where if people want to find me, that's where they'll generally find my stuff. Just Buhanka Watch or Micheal Delabrock should bring up the relevant links.
And always, as I ask, if anybody wants to send you any money, where they can send it?
I do have a PayPal, but I'm trying to get off PayPal because I don't think it's very reliable, if I'm going to be honest. But PayPal, coffee, places like that. But let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, okay, cool. Hang on, I'm just checking. I've got sound. Yep, got it. Okay, thanks for that. So everyone, buckle up. This isn't for the faint-hearted. If you feel it, don't you? That creeping dread, the weight of the world held hostage by a psychopathic superpower. They spy from the skies, their drones humming like vultures, transmitting viruses straight into the mind's eye. They don't just want to control, they want your soul. They wrap their allies in silk like a spider ties up flies, hand-picking parasites to rule their servile satellites. These puppets know who they dare not criticize. One wrong word and it's vassalage or war. That's the deal, bow or burn. The Casablanca whore shrieks it from the rooftops, doesn't she? Slaughtered by proxy, the hidden hand, the cat's paw. They don't fight their wars, they make you fight them. They anoint criminals, hoist false flags, and when the missiles fall, when nations shatter, they shrug. It's happening, they say, but it's not happening, and you believe them. That's the hypnosis, that's the psychosis, that's the coup that nobody noticed. They're so conceited now, so drunk on power, they don't even hide it anymore. They brag, we cheated, we stole, we lied, they crow. We came, we saw, he died. And the crowd claps like trained seals, kissing the ring of Potus, swearing allegiance to a throne that's rotting from the inside out. The empire's constitution withered on the vine, propping up the dollar and the drone. It slumps, degenerate, delusional, while the world chokes on its lies. Is this how it dies? Then, not with a bang, but with a whimper, an empire so bloated it can't see its own decay, so blind it thinks it's invincible. But the cracks are there, the allies waver, the satellites tremble, the ring they kiss, it's tarnished, and we're here in Minsk shining a light on it all. This is a historic crisis, and you're not just watching, you're part of it. So join us, share the stream, like it, comment, scream into the void if you have to, tell the world what's unfolding, because if we don't speak, we'll don't fight this hypnosis. We're just another fly in their web. This is live show 143 on June 22, 2025 from Minsk, Belarus with Micheal from Buhanka Watch. Let's break the spell together. So let's start, Micheal. We've got a few questions for you. Let's start with the Israeli and Iranian war. How have NATO leaders' displays of deference to President Trump at the 2025 Hague summit influenced their diplomatic responses to Israel's Operation Rising Lion against Iran's nuclear facilities? And what does it reveal about their prioritization of US approval over regional stability?
Well, the NATO summit came after the conflict had pretty much ended, but I mean, it was kind of typical that you'd have the usual platitudes about defending Israel's right to exist, despite the fact that they pretty much blatantly engaged in an act of perfidy and unwarranted aggression, in my view. I think NATO wasn't really much of a player at all in what happened in Israel and Iran. I think NATO was pretty much the Israeli and an American show. I think NATO, especially European NATO, is more focused on trying to keep the Americans on board in terms of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, rather than Middle Eastern affairs. But I do find it quite interesting just how much their views seem to have changed in regards to Donald Trump, given how publicly that European NATO leaders especially are extremely critical of Trump at pretty much every opportunity, but then they kowtow totally to his demands on NATO, seemingly. So that was quite an interesting. I mean, I think I'd probably, in the American, the Trump position, I think I'd probably have more sympathy with him in terms of his policy on NATO than the Europeans, because I do think NATO does need to step up.
Do you think they were being nice to him because he's in power and they're just waiting until, like they don't want him to do anything with NATO or leave or something, or downgrade it until he leaves, and then they'll be back to normal?
I think it's kind of just part of the wider vibe shift that we've seen in American politics. Is there's just an understanding that you're not going to beat Trump as such. You can't really outlast him. It's just going to be like this is the established order now. You might as well just get on board with it to a degree. I think that was kind of probably what the wider view in NATO has been. European NATO, that it's just, this is it. We do need to step up because of what's happened in Eastern Europe in regards of Russia and Ukraine. So, you could try and resist, but then again, the winds of change are just kind of pushing that direction, whether you agree or not that, Russia is this threat to Europe. And I think it's largely overblown threat. I don't think the Russians are capable, let alone looking to attack Europe in any large degree that's being put out there. This idea that the Russians are just going to somehow storm across the Baltics and take Poland is not really a viable outcome at all. So I do think it is kind of overblown, but at the same time, like European NATO definitely does need to step up in terms of its funding, because it is just basically an American protectorate agreement. As the old adage that I believe it's the American Foreign Secretary, the Defense Secretary at the moment, is why are 360 million American citizens being asked to protect 500 million Europeans from 160 million Russians. That is actually quite a pretty competent and viable argument. So I do think that there is definitely a need to push European NATO to basically pull its weight. So I kind of would agree with that, with Trump in that respect to a large degree.
In what ways does the Israeli-Iran conflict escalating since 2025 June serve as a distraction for global powers, allowing the US to reinforce its dominance while vassal states scramble to align with Trump's tariff policies to avoid economic retaliation?
I'm not too sure if it does, if we're going to be honest, because I actually think probably in a long-term view that the Iran-Israel affair is probably going to actually have been detrimental to American global power. I think it's caused them to take the eye off the ball on particularly China. I think that's kind of where things are probably going to go, is this investment in the Middle East has probably caused the United States to take its view off, because you had the withdrawal of military assets from the Asia Pacific area. Then you had the withdrawal of a significant amount of military support going to Ukraine and in Europe to support Israel. So I do think that there's probably a lot of unseen ramifications at the moment about the decline of general American hegemony in certain respects, because of its fixation with defending the state in the Middle East. It really doesn't actually provide very much to the United States in a geostrategic point of view.
Mm-hmm. Okay, how does the Kremlin's muted response to Israeli strikes on Iran, despite its strategic partnership with Tehran, reflect Russia's fear of losing Middle Eastern influence, and what does this suggest about the limits of its defiance against US-led pressures?
Well, the problem with Russia is that Russia actually has a far more complicated and nuanced relationship with particularly Israel at the moment. There's a significant Russian-speaking post-Soviet population of Israeli Jews.
1.5 million.
Yeah. Netanyahu was actually boasts about his positive relationship with Putin quite significantly, especially in electoral terms. So this idea that Russia was always going to be a pretty much uncritical ally of Tehran, I don't think was ever really a viable proposition. So I think Russia's probably actually going to come out as yet again probably a bit of a loser out of this. I think the Iranians have probably woken up to the fact that you can't really depend on Moscow to the extent that they probably were expecting themselves to be able to, because of this complicated relationship that the Russians have always kind of maintained with Israel.
Putin did ask them if they wanted to sign an alliance, like military pact, but they refused a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
So it was the Iranians that actually stopped it.
Yeah, but even then, had they signed that up, I would have been very surprised if, like, if Russia was ever going to put boots on the I don't think that was ever a viable proposition that Moscow was ever going to militarily, kinetically defend Tehran. Because, like I say, this relationship with Israel, the geopolitics of the wider region. Also, I think Russia is probably quite invested in certain events in Eastern Europe at the moment that it just doesn't have the physical military capability to focus on getting involved in a war in the Middle East, let alone a war against Israel for the defense of Tehran. Like, I think a lot of people kind of overhype these ideas of things like BRICS and the like, assuming that, these are like de facto defense arrangements. They're not. They're actually fairly nebulous agreements that the Russians often sign. A lot of it's economic, a lot of it's diplomatic. It'll be like diplomatic support or the like. Rather than actual de facto military alliances. I think the only country in the Middle East that sort of had that agreement to any large extent was Syria. And look at what happened in Syria. And again, while Russia is heavily engaged in Ukraine, I don't think there really is any kind of proposition that there'll be like, Russian troops are going to emerge out of come to defend countries in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's get on the other one from Israel, Gaza, the genocide. How does the fawning gestures of global leaders towards Trump, particularly over tariff exemptions, correlate with the reluctance to condemn Israel's actions in Gaza despite mounting evidence of war crimes and genocide as outlined by legal scholars in 2025?
Sorry, could you repeat that again?
How does the fawning gestures of global leaders towards Trump, particularly over tariff exemptions, correlate with the reluctance to condemn Israel's actions in Gaza?
I'm not too sure if there is much of a correlation there, if I'm going to be honest. Well, I'm sure there is certain bits that are going on behind the scenes where the Americans are probably trying to push certain things in Israel's favor. I don't think that Trump is using the tariff issue to say to European states, like you have to be on board with Israel, because I think a lot of European states are, because like the Israeli issue to me it's like a generational issue. Boomers particularly are obsessed with things like the Holocaust, and we have to support Israel because of the Holocaust and what happened in the 1940s and the like. So I view it more as a generational gap. And that's why I think a lot of European leaders in power at the moment have this sort of inherent Israel. I'm not too sure what the correct term would be, but this inherent support for Israel. You do see, particularly the Spanish, to a degree, the Irish governments, and increasingly the Labour government in Britain. Some of its members are kind of trying to push back because they're under pressure from the Muslim vote in the UK. But you do sort of see tentative criticism coming out against Israel here and there. But ultimately, I'm going to be real. Apart from like the Iran conflict, which caught my attention, I've just had to kind of check out of the Israel stuff because the hypocrisy. There's only so many days you can look at Telegram or Twitter at the certain channels and see pictures of mutilated kids. Anyone with the eyes to see can see what is happening in Gaza. It is effectively a genocide. The Israelis are going in there, just flattening the place, pretty much trying to force the population out in a form of ethnic cleansing, if not an outright genocide. And then you get people who, particularly Western politicians, particularly right-wing ones as well, particularly of this boomer mindset, who are just like, well, Israel can do no wrong because the Holocaust might happen again or something, and they overlook what's happening. Like, I'm by no stretch like a fan of Islam or the Muslim world in general, but like I can see that what's being done in Gaza and to the Palestinians is an atrocity. It's a historical atrocity. So it just like I say, I've just kind of had to check out of it because there is no nuance in this debate. People are in their camps. You'll never change them from it, but it's just the hypocrisy of it, particularly from people who are meant to be on like my side of the issue, who are like, they'll claim that at once like the Russians are basically genociding the Ukrainians because maybe, and don't get me wrong, I know this will be taken out of context by the usual people, but over the course of a week, the Russians might kill 5 Ukrainian civilians via like an errant drone strike or a missile strike in Kiev. And that's, basically ethnic cleansing to certain people. But then, 500 Palestinians killed at a humanitarian airdrop by the IDF in the space of one day is we don't care about that because Hamas did October 7th. So, like where is the nuance or the intellectual discussion to be had in that kind of environment around these kind of issues? So I know it's probably a bit of a cop out and some people might get upset at that. But it's just, how many, you just look at the pictures coming out of Gaza and it's mutilated kids. And, you can't, personally, I just can't spend day in and day out focusing on that. So I had to take a step back on it and just kind of retrench myself back in like Russia and Ukraine. Things like Syria, Iran, and the like, whenever those pick up, I take an interest in that. And it's not to say that, I've washed my hands of the Palestinian issue. I haven't, but, it's just, you just can't look at what comes out of Gaza on a daily basis and keep your head straight. Like I say, the Western governments who look at this stuff know this is happening and then just come out with the line that, Israel has a right to defend itself. And it's like, well, like, seriously, guys. And again, I'm sure there is a lot of American influence that goes on behind the scenes to do that, but I don't think Trump is using the tariffs to say, like, you have to be pro-Israel, because I think a lot of these European governments are just, because they're boomers and because they're Europeans, and what happened in the 1940s is, the bedrock of Western history, apparently, is that's why they'll give this uncritical view to the Zionist state. But, I think, unfortunately, it'll have to be the next generation, whenever the not pointed at you, Dave, not pointed at you, but, whenever the boomers sort of cycle out. And,
sorry, I'm an ex. I'm not a boomer.
Well, there you go. Sorry, I feel bad now. But whenever the boomers sort of cycle out of the, the generational, I think that's whenever you'll start to get some serious, like, political and diplomatic ramifications for Israel. Because, as I said in the channel the other day, I don't think anyone under the age of 35 gives a fuck about the Holocaust. It just doesn't have that hold on us anymore. We haven't grown up with that. If anything, and again, this is probably going to be taken out of context by anything, like, whenever people bring up the Holocaust to people like my age or younger, like it's kind of a thing of mockery. It's like this golden cow that can't be touched, and it's used to justify, some of the biggest atrocities in the world in the present day. So I think like people my age and younger just sort of look at this and they're just like, okay, well, if this is the kind of your ultimate legitimacy to carry out these atrocities, well, we're just going to mock it back at you. Like, this holds no water to us.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sick of hearing about it all the time.
Yeah.
I always bring it up. Okay, let's go to Europe, Ukraine, Russia. How has the fawning behaviour of NATO leaders towards Trump at the 2025 Hague summit impacted their commitment to sustain military and economic support for Ukraine against Russia's ongoing invasion?
How do I couch this word? I'd be interested to see if they will justify, because I'm very curious and skeptical of the idea that a lot of European states could sustain 5% on GDP defense spending.
Yeah, did you notice that some of that is they're allowed to spend 1.5% or something on other things like roads and all that? So it's actually infrastructure inside the country.
Yeah, so a lot of it, yeah, that's how they'll fiddle it. So that's what I'm kind of curious if what they might end up doing, some of these states in the short to medium term, is if they might start lumping in aid to Ukraine into this 5% figure.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of where my suspicion will come from. Again, we don't, because the American administration seems to be very schizophrenic on Ukraine. One day it's this way, the next week it's that way. Everything's pushed to the back as soon as Israel comes into the fray. One day Trump's very pro-Putin, the next day he's suddenly pro-Zelensky. So, it's hard to estimate where exactly the US administration is going to go down on this. But I think generally the Europeans, especially via the EU, are kind of in it for the long haul. So I do expect that there'll be military aid will continue to funnel into Ukraine. But the question is even with the amount that's still going into it at this moment, it's not particularly good on the front for the Ukrainians at the moment. The Russians have kind of stalled, or they've put on an operational pause for the moment. But unless the United States, like for things probably to meaningfully change in Ukraine, is Trump would probably have to like double or triple the amount of aid that the Biden administration was sending to Ukraine at its peak. And I'm not too sure if I see that on the cards, unless like Vladimir Putin decides to come out and personally insult Trump or something. I do not see the administration at this stage doing those kind of things. I could see a resumption of things like Patriot ammunition, new missiles for Patriot and anti-ballistic missiles and the like being funneled back to Ukraine now that the situation in the Middle East has seemed somewhat stabilized. Like there'll still be aid going into Europe, but unless it drastically increases, which I can't see the Europeans having the political stomach or the economic clout to sustain, let alone sustain, but increase massively. I don't think it's going to necessarily change the dial very much. I think the ball is kind of set as it is. Everything's kind of, basically this war will be decided to a large degree in Washington and Moscow. The Russians will continue to be on the advance here and there. They'll be stalled in some places. They'll take territory here, but until Moscow and Washington decide to actually either Moscow calls it quits, or Washington decides like we're going to massively increase aid to Ukraine in order to deter the Russians, or put some kind of major sanctions on the Russians that seriously impacts things like the oil industry. I don't think the ultimate calculus of how things are going is going to change much one way or the other.
In what ways does the US strategic pivot to prioritize Israeli conflicts, as seen in its response to Iran and Gaza, reflect a broader hidden hand agenda to divert resources from Ukraine, weakening its defense against the Russians?
Well, the way you kind of word that, it sounds like this is like an ulterior motive of Trump to weaken Ukraine, or my sort of parceling that out wrong. Because I don't think the administration, I don't think Trump is out to like kneecap Ukraine just for the sake of kneecapping Ukraine. I think Washington ultimately views Israel as first and foremost above everything whenever push comes to shove in Ukraine, Europe. Everything else comes second to that. That's kind of how I view it.
Okay.
Or did I sort of misunderstand the premise of the question?
No, that's right. How does the interplay of Russia's attempt to exploit global distractions such as the Israeli-Iran war and the servile alignment of European leaders with Trump illustrate the psychosis of global order that undermines Ukraine's fight for sovereignty?
How does Russia... Sorry, could you just repeat the first part of that?
How does the interplay of Russia's attempt to exploit global distractions, like the Israeli-Iran war, illustrate the psychosis of global order that undermines Ukraine's fight for sovereignty?
Undermines the psychosis. I'm not too sure quite how to address that. Like, I do think the Russians did exploit what happened in Iran in the sense that they significantly increased missile strikes and drone strikes, and it became very apparent that the Ukrainian air defense was certainly very much lacking in a lot of these strikes. A lot of drones were getting through and hitting targets in Kiev and parts of Ukraine. But I don't think, like, apart from an increase in missile strikes and the like, I didn't really see much of the Russians really exploiting what happened. The eye being taken off Ukraine to a large degree. There wasn't like a massive offensive. There wasn't anything particularly new. That was just a large increase in missile strikes. But I do.
You think the Russians are going to actually do some sort of massive arrow attack? You know, like push the front quickly?
There was some indications that they were preparing for that, and potentially still are in Sumy Oblast. They've been massing a lot of troops up there, and a lot of those troops haven't really been seen on that front up there. So that's kind of where we're expecting it if the Russians are going to do that kind of offensive. And let's be honest, they haven't done that offensive since basically like 2023. But at the same time, the way offensives have kind of worked in this war is it's just the Russians have put more pressure. They've just fed men into the front all along the line and just increased the pressure along the line rather than these concentrated offensives, because those don't quite work in this, I don't want to say modern conflict, but the conflict in Ukraine, because the second you start to mass armor and stuff in one area, it becomes a big target for missiles and Ukrainian artillery and the like. So they kind of just feed it piecemeal into other parts of the front. And there has been indications that has happened over the last month, particularly in places like Kharkov, down in Zaporizhia and around Pokrovsk. But the fighting in Sumy has kind of stabilized. The Ukrainians seem to have stabilized the front, but then another aspect of it is the Russians aren't really going on the offensive up in Sumy anymore. But we still have all this evidence that there are significant amounts of new Russian troops in the Kursk Oblast area. So the logical assumption will be that the Russians are looking to make a push in that area, but they obviously haven't yet so far. So there is still kind of a question mark over what exactly there is going to happen up there, or what those men are there for at the moment.
Okay. I've got a few questions if you just want to answer these really shortly, quick, okay?
Yeah, no problem.
How do modern superpowers use surveillance technology to maintain influence over allied nations?
Well, as you've seen with... sorry. What was that? As you've seen with the WikiLeaks revelations in the previous decade, it's like the United States were using the NSA to spy on the German government to find like diplomatic and baggage they could hold against the Germans in various negotiations and preempt the Germans in certain like economic deals and stuff like that. So, allies spy on each other all the time. and especially with things as we become more cyberized and the world moves more digital, that's only going to increase. I expect the Americans, and going back to the previous topic, I expect the Israelis probably, especially in the United States and certain other countries, probably have untold levels of intelligence on Western governments and supposed allies that they use to curry influence and the like. The United States, like I say, was revealed they did it via WikiLeaks. I wouldn't be surprised if European countries are doing it to each other. This is just kind of par for the course. Stuff like that. It's all, just because you're an ally doesn't mean you aren't a competitor. And if you can get your comms inside of like trade negotiations of a friendly power, well, then if you know what their demands are, then you can preempt them and undermine them to secure better terms for yourself. So I mean, this stuff happens all the time.
What role do economic sanctions play in enforcing vassalage among smaller countries?
Depends on the country, but generally, like the way I view sanctions ultimately is a way to see. People have this idea that sanctions against Russia were just trying to cut off the Russian state budget and make the country poor. No, the way I view sanctions is effectively sanctions are a long-term project, in my view, a long-term project to provoke a revolution in another country, because sanctions ultimately don't really target. They do, but they don't. The people who are most hurt by sanctions tend to be the poorest people, the wider populace of a country subject to them. And the idea is to make the populace of that country upset, angry, and then willing to engage in color revolutions and overthrow a country's government. That's kind of what I view sanctions as. That the ultimate end goal is it's a decade-long process, is an economic drag, and ultimately a way to try and destabilize a country. So smaller countries like Iran and the Iranian economy, if it wasn't subject to sanctions, it'd probably be next to Saudi Arabia as one of the largest economies in the Middle East. Well, hypothetically, because I don't think the Iranians, even if they didn't have sanctions, are necessarily very economically minded or competent in economics. But certainly, well, you've seen the idea that the United States is threatened to put sanctions on ICJ judges for the trial against Netanyahu for genocide and the like. So certain things like that, of course, that's more targeted at individuals rather than certain European countries, because it'd be very interesting. It depends on the context of what the sanctions are, the country targeted, because like I say, trying to overthrow a government, that's what the sanctions against Russia, against Iran, against Myanmar, places like that are trying to do. Sanctions against Turkey, because the Turks are bought S-400 as opposed to an American air defense system. That's more just trying to shape the sanctions there are the Turks were kicked out of the Joint Strike Fighter program. It's more targeted at economic levers, very specific technological things, rather than sanctions against a country in general. So it kind of depends on the specific sanctions, the country involved, what the sanctions are actually targeted at.
By international law, the only organization that can do sanctions is the United Nations. You know that?
Well,
yeah, I know. So how
does it?
Yeah, I know. How have historical false flag operations shaped public perceptions of global conflicts?
Well, I mean, the obvious one would come up to the Gulf of Tonkin incident that the United States into Vietnam. I mean, you could have some, personally, I think 9/11 was down to Muslims being Muslims. That's kind of, I'm sure there was other stuff going on behind that, but generally I ascribe 9/11 to Al Qaeda in Islamic terrorism. That's kind of where I approach that. But hypothetically, let's say that was something other than what is portrayed, then obviously that was kind of a very successful casus belli to get the United States militarily involved. To this day, was it 24 years later, still in the Middle East? in favor of a certain country in the Middle East. And I don't think if anything, that the American interventions in the Middle East have done nothing but sap American strength in the long term. So what other false flags immediately come to hand? There's a couple in the back of my head, but they're
They were going to do one for Cuba, weren't they? They're trying to get an invasion.
Oh yeah. They were gonna set off bombs in Dallas or something as well, Miami. Yeah, and that obviously the CIA never went through with that in the end, and they ended up invading Cuba anyway, and then they lost pretty badly out of it. But so yeah, I mean, I'm sure this stuff happens all the time. I am growing, like my initial views on October 7th were, this was just a big lapse of judgment. But, everything that's happened since October 7th, I'm increasingly becoming aware that, how does the Israeli Mossad able to infiltrate Hezbollah, the Iranian regime, completely riddle its way right through it from top to bottom, but then somehow it doesn't see October 7th coming? I think there's some serious questions need to be asked about that. Increasingly viewing that is not a false flag. I do think it was obvious that Hamas went in there, but I am increasingly of the view that maybe there might have been some actors in the Israeli state that would have thought, well, maybe it might not have been such a bad idea if Hamas goes in and does this. So we then have this casus belli to effectively reshape the Middle East to our whims. So it's kind of, if that does turn out to be true, we'll probably only ever find out about it, after we're all dead 200 years down the line. But then that'd probably be one of the most, because, as much as I abhor the Israeli state and what it does, I think it is pretty obvious that they've pretty much won a complete total victory in the Middle East at this stage. They've openly open aggression against, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Iraq, five of its neighbors. If you're including Yemen as well, 6 of its neighbors it's bombed and attacked. At least 4 of those unprovoked, just acts of unwarranted aggression. Including the seizure of territory and the potential annexing of more land. Yet, it's okay because Israel's allowed to do that.
Well, Syria said today that Israel can have the Golan Heights now.
Yeah, well, it's my views on the current Syrian administration are I'm sure most people would not be surprised to find out they are extremely low. But the only problem for Giuliani and his Al-Qaeda band of Christian murdering, Alawite genociding scumbags is that the Israelis evidently aren't content with the Golan Heights, and they're now trying to detach the entire south from Syria.
How do international organizations like NATO or the UN reinforce the dominance of certain powers?
Well, things like if you're on the Security Council, the UN, that obviously gives you a significant amount of diplomatic weight because you can just veto resolutions and the like that come via the Security Council in the United Nations, which obviously reaffirms the diplomatic standing of the member states on it. It also prevents the reform of the Security Council from admitting new members to it. NATO obviously it's kind of strange because Trump's kind of pushing back against it, but I think the United States has probably done more good out of NATO than it this idea that the Americans pay for it and therefore it's an inherently bad thing. Well, I mean, the Americans have held Western Europe in effect as a protectorate since the end of World War II via NATO. So that obviously, this is kind of why I think the United States particularly was always against the idea of Russia joining NATO. This idea that, Mikhail Gorbachev floated it. And then Vladimir Putin, surprisingly, in hindsight, whenever he first came into power, was actually surprisingly open to the idea and floated the idea of Russian accession to NATO. But the problem is that the United States, because of the inherent nature of the power it is, whenever it joins an international organization, it's not looking to join it as an equal power. It's looking to join it as an extension of its influence. So, Russia could never join NATO because the United States could not tolerate even though Russia is not an equal military power to NATO, it would be a significantly larger power militarily in NATO than any of the other member states, bar NATO, bar the United States. And I don't think the United States could have tolerated the idea that you would have had. The United States is effectively the hyperpower in NATO, but then again, a major power in NATO that would, in the form of Russia, which ideologically and diplomatically has a fairly different outlook on the United States. NATO can be corralled whenever it's these disparate European states by the US. As that, but you introduce a large state like Russia into it, then that's whenever you'd start to get serious friction. I mean, look at the frictions that Charles de Gaulle caused just with France whenever he really wanted to back in the 50s, the late 50s and early 60s with NATO. Whenever the French pulled out of the chain of command, well, if you could imagine the Americans trying to tolerate like the Russians involved in that. I don't think they could have countenanced the idea because it would have been a diminution of their own influence and stuff. The United States is the big fish in the small pond. They don't want another, not as big fish, but larger fish than the others in that pond with them as well. This is why Trump floating the idea that the United States should join like the Commonwealth. Well, I have my certain views on the Commonwealth of Nations and stuff, but I wouldn't want the United States involved in it because as deracinated as the Commonwealth is at the moment, the last thing it needs is the United States coming into it and then making it into, they'd use it as an organ for diplomatic influence, which I don't think the Commonwealth should be there for.
Yeah. So what motivates leaders of satellite states to align with the superpower despite potential loss of autonomy?
Defense and economic benefits is kind of what they've always been there unless they've been coerced into it. So like the states in Eastern Europe and the Warsaw Pact, they were obviously coerced to become satellite states of the USSR. The states in Western Europe, to a degree, there was an economic coercion via the Marshall Plan in certain respects like that. But then again, there was also just this inherent fear of the Soviet Union and through the Cold War. In the modern era, I think you've kind of had a bit of a diminution of that because you have a lot of European states that are trying to exert themselves via the EU, which I think would be a disaster. Like personally, I'd actually kind of have a lot of sympathy for de Gaulleism. I think that, countries should be sovereign, is that, if there's bilateral agreements and stuff, like I do think Britain should be in NATO and the like, but we shouldn't be signing up to international courts. We shouldn't, I think we should have like a country, like if the politicians in that country should be able to overrule any international agreement if it's in the interest of that country. You should be able to abrogate a treaty and the like. I don't think like it just going on about Britain. I don't think like the United States, we should be as it's different around Trump because I do think that there's potentially a lot of benefits for the UK if the British government wasn't as incompetent and self-hating as it is. Trump obviously surprisingly for US president actually feels quite warmly about Britain. And I think it's a detriment to the British government. Well, then again, it is the British government, so it absolutely despises its own concept of its country. But at this stage, a competent British government would probably be getting in there. I shudder to say it, but kind of like the Israelis and saying like, look, you like our country, Trump, like your grandmother came from Scotland, throw this praise on him. And he obviously likes that and throws goodies back. But, the Trump administration aside, look at Obama, look at Biden. I don't think the United States is actually that much of an ally to the United Kingdom. So like, depending on the administration and power, certainly there could be warm feelings and good agreements that are made. But I don't think the idea that Britain should have to base its defense needs its economics on the United States or even necessarily the Europeans, to me, it doesn't really make sense, because most of our defense needs are actually a result of our kind of like toadian adherence to American geopolitical policy. Like why is the United Kingdom at odds with Iran? Well, it's because of our implicit support of Israel and our alliance with the United States. Like, we've had no real connection to Iran since 1979.
Mm-hmm.
The animosity there is because of our actions in the region, and our actions in the region have been because of our alliance and commitments to the United States, and the United States in turn because of its connections to Israel. So, like, personally, like, I'd remain a member of NATO, but in terms of like these, like, I definitely wouldn't have gone into Afghanistan. No, I wouldn't have gone into Iraq. Probably would have gone into Afghanistan, but not in a military combat mission in the way that we went.
Just gone in, done the business, and then left straight away, maybe.
Not even, because it's kind of nuanced, and obviously history has shown it that the entire thing collapsed. But I do think that there was probably a good moral mission made in Afghanistan. You had this basket case of a country that was run by savages, and then I do think that there was a case made for nation building there, but of course it all fell apart in the end, because ultimately the Americans took us in there, and then it was the Americans who scarpered out at the last minute and left everyone to their own devices, which kind of shows, like, I wouldn't embark on I don't think it's in Britain's interest to embark on military adventures at the behest of the United States. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, what do you think the social and cultural impacts of a nation being reduced to a servile satellite state is?
Wow, I'm assuming that pretty much inherently is you'd have a significant amount of cultural impact from the administering power. Like, I'll kind of use the USSR in this. All
like the French in Africa and some of those countries, maybe.
Yeah, people learn the language. Like the Russian was taught in all the Warsaw Pact states. You have the ideological impact. Obviously, the Soviet Union imparted communism, Marxist-Leninism onto its satellite states. The United States potentially still does, but it's certainly taken a back seat under Trump so far. But the United States historically has been a big promoter of the most horrific kind of decadent progressive liberalism across the West, overtly via funding political organizations, and then culturally via the poisonous influence of American culture via Hollywood, and this idea that diversity is our strength and all this kind of stuff. A lot of that. Some of that is definitely European grown, but the reason why it's become so evident is because of the hegemony of American culture via Hollywood and stuff like that just pumps it into everyone's brains that diversity is good. Only one ethnic group can only ever be racist. Certain events in the 1940s are basically the bedrock of all Western civilization, and is the basis for everything that happens in the world today, and that kind of stuff. And then obviously you'll have the strong economic influence, the petrodollar, obviously ensuring the preeminence of the American dollar in global affairs, and the fact that most stuff is rooted via New York, to a degree London, but certainly New York in terms of international trade.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a wrap for live show 143, straight from Minsk, Belarus, today, June 29, 2025. Okay, big thanks to Micheal from Buhanka Watch, who's joined tonight's show. And again, where can people get her again?
Like I say, just look up Micheal Delabrock or Buhanka Watch, and it should take you to my Telegram or my Twitter account. I do have to apologize. I've been a little bit scatterbrained today. It's been one of these days. You go on the internet and you look at the news, and then you're just like, as I was saying to you before we went live on air, your head just gets pickled by it.
Yeah,
you start to self-radicalize. Your mind goes off in different places, and the phrase just kind of left me just a slightly bit scatterbrained. So I do apologize to you, Dave, and the viewers that I've probably not performed completely up to par in this show.
Oh, that's fine. And speaking of the viewers, share the stream on Rumble, X, YouTube, like it, comment, and that's it. Until next time, stay sharp, and we're out of here. Thank you very much. Bye.
No problem. See you guys.